Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this ninth lecture in the monthly series on history and heritage, the afterlife of monuments. This month, the month of June, this is the second lecture. We had one earlier, and today we are meeting virtually, not live in the IIC conference room. We have been fortunate in that we have been able to arrange talks both in person in IIC and also virtually, and both have their distinct advantages. And so I'm glad we followed up the in-person talk with the virtual talk this month. I would like to thank India International Center for hosting the series and to the program office for running it efficiently. We started the lecture series. It is a monthly lecture series. We started this history and heritage lecture series in November last year. And the first speaker in the series was Dr. Shashank Sinha, who is our chair this evening. He brought to us stories from some of the monuments in Delhi and Agra, which he had included and published in his recent book on Delhi, Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, and Connected Histories. Since then, we have covered many monuments and heritage sites across the country, such as Sarnath, Hampi, Shahjahanabad, Sufi shrines, Bhatinda Fort in Punjab, and the earlier lecture this month was on UNESCO. On 24th of August, we hope to bring you recent research by Dr. Kathleen Cummings on the temples of Nagpur, built by the Bhosles in the 17th and 18th century. And on 14th September, we have Ratish Nanda, who will speak on the ongoing conservation work at the Qutub Shahi tombs in Hyderabad. Now, one of the reasons why IIC agreed to host this series and why I was interested in coordinating it was the fact that we need to highlight the importance of monuments as public spaces. And it is around monuments and in these public spaces that the visitor comes closest to experiencing history. And I'm really grateful to the speakers who have helped me continue this monthly series, for sharing their valuable time and for sharing their vast knowledge with all of us. Our speakers have discussed monuments not only as relics of a bygone age, but as reminders of a cultural environment that we have sought to nurture and develop. We must remember that not all monuments survive, not all monuments are preserved. And what the monuments that we see around us are the monuments that form our cultural milieu and have resulted from an active engagement with the past. And this is our legacy to the future generations. So in a way, then, monuments reflect our understanding of the world that we have preserved around us. My request to the audience and to all of you who have registered, please do continue your interest in the series and hope to welcome you to many more lectures. With these words, I request the chairperson of this evening, Dr. Shashank Shekhar Sinha, whom I've already mentioned. He's a historian and an independent researcher, to share this evening's talk, and I hand over the mic to him. Dr. Sinha.
Thank you, Professor Ray, and welcome all of you who have joined today, and all those who you would be, basically listening afterwards. I'm naturally delighted to reconnect with this series of lectures. So it's like a, coming back again to that platform, but more delighted to be on this virtual days with, both with the convener of the series, the IC, and on this virtual days with a friend whose work I admire, Dr. Srikumar Menon. He describes himself as an architect who specializes in, ancient and early architecture of the Indian subcontinent, which includes prehistoric monuments, as well as, early temples and stupas. But he wears many hats, and very elegantly. He had an independent architectural practice. He was associated with several, very, important centers. One is Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. Uh, he was with the Faculty of Architecture, Manipal Institute of Technology, was there for almost 15 years, and then he's currently with the NIAS Institute, NIAS, which is National Institute of Advanced Studies, as associate professor. He's been the recipient of two very prestigious fellowships, Professor D.S. Achyuta Rao Memorial History Research Fellowship, as well as Homi Bhabha Fellowship, during the course of which he's been, exploring sites in northern Karnataka. He's the author of two books, both published by Manipal University Press, Ancient Stone Riddles, and which are about megaliths of Indian subcontinent, and comets. So there you see the astronomy coming there, nomads of the solar system. Uh, for those of you who follow him on the Facebook, he's a very avid photographer, very, very beautiful shots. And I know I call him a visual anthropologist as well, who likes to say things in pictures, basically. And you see the pictures, that he, puts on this site, tell, narrate a story so beautifully. And today he is with us, to talk about monuments of the early Chalukyas of Badami. And these happen to be some of the earliest examples of stone building or temple architecture in stone in the southern India. He would be particularly talking about two open mantapas on the north fort, besides this thing, which are located on the top of a spur. What is fascinating is the layers that you would see in this talk, basically. So whether it is the architecture or the principles of construction and design alternatives, or the relationship with the surrounding landscape, this golden landscape of sandstone cliffs and deep gorges, or the imagination of the architects, or the way these monuments were originally conceptualized, basically. It's a lot of layers which he'll be uncovering today. I don't want to spoil the talk by saying anything more, but in the process, he would be busting several myths. And I could assure you one more thing, that is, you'll be, in for a very interesting virtual and an illustrative tour, a graphic illustrative tour of that. Before I invite Dr. Menon, some words about the housekeeping. Please keep your mobiles on the silent mode. That's something which is being said across all seminars, and by now you know it so well. But also, more importantly, from the point of view of today's lecture, keep typing your questions in the question Q&A session. So after the presentation by this speaker today, we'll be having a question answer session. So please keep typing your question answers in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. So thank you, and over to you, Dr. Menon.
Thank you, Dr. Shashank. Thank you for a very wonderful introduction. I hope that the talk will live up to at least a part of that, the hype that you created about the virtual tour. At the outset, before I start, I would like to thank Professor Himanshu Prabha Rai and the Indian International Center for very kindly having me here for this talk today. And now, without much further ado, I will straight away plunge into my topic. I'll just share my screen. I hope. Is it visible now? Can you see my?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I'll be talking to you about a part of India that I'm very much in love with. I've been in love with it from the time I first set foot there in 2008, and I've been returning very often here. That is the Malaprabha Valley, the valley of the river Malaprabha, where you have the very well-known sites of Badami, Aihole, and Pattadakal. I'll be talking to you about how the temples are. In particular, one particular structure I will be concentrating on. So though we'll be in general talking about the temples of the Vatapi Chalukyas, the early Chalukyas who ruled the region for about 200 years from middle of 6th century to the middle of 8th century. But I will be talking particularly about this structure that you see here, the two open mantapas, and we'll try to figure out what the people who built it envisaged it when they were, and why did they not complete it. So yes. So it all starts with the river Malaprabha, like I told you. This is a tributary of the river Krishna. It originates on the eastern flank of the Western Ghats in a small place called Kanakumbi in northern Karnataka, and then flows down the Western Ghats and meanders through northern Karnataka around 300 odd kilometers before it meets the river Krishna. But before its confluence with Krishna, for around 25 kilometers, it flows through a wonderful region, very dramatic region of sandstone outcrops. This Google Earth image shows you all the knobs that you see here are in the north and the south are the flat-topped low hillocks of sandstone, which hem in the river, which you can see as a light blue line, which is meandering across like that. Okay, so just north of the region where it enters the valley, you have the site of Badami, which was the capital of the early Chalukyas of Badami. And then roughly in the middle of the stretch, the river takes a pronounced turn towards the north. And that's where you have the World Heritage Site of Pattadakal, with the famous Pattadakal group of temples. And where the river exits the valley, you have Aihole, the settlement of Aihole. But these three are by no means the only sites of the early Chalukyas. They're very important from the terms of understanding how Indian temple architecture in stone developed, because here you see some of the earliest temples in stone in southern India. There are plenty of other sites also. There's Huligamana Kolla, a little bit north of Pattadakal. There are the quarries of the artisans that you see scattered in the hills around Pattadakal. There's Mahakuta, many of the other sites, some of which we will refer to in our journey today. So when you look at Badami, so when Pulakeshi, the first in the middle of 6th century, when he established it as the capital of the Chalukyas, what he did was that he found this C-shaped or horseshoe-shaped sort of depression in the middle of high sandstone cliffs, and he constructed a bund across the western edge, which collected all the rainwater coming off, all the catchment coming off from these surrounding areas. And the Agastya Tirtha, the water body here in the center, was born. And the modern town settlement of Badami, you find mostly in the western part of this reservoir. And we suspect that the ancient settlement also is below the same region. The famous rock cut or cave temples of Badami are in the southern cliffs here. They've been scooped out of the southern cliffs. And they are what are informally referred to as cave temples, but they're actually scooped out of the living rock. And the structural monuments, which are built by arranging blocks of sandstone on dressed blocks of sandstone, they are in the North Fort, what is known as the North Fort. And there's also this famous Bhutanatha temple, which very dramatically sticks into the water body here on the eastern end. For those of you, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Badami, but for those of you who are not, I'll just give a brief introduction before plunging into the nitty-gritties of what the mantapas were and all that. So if you stand on top of the cliff and look towards the settlement, you see a typical sort of settlement that you find in hot, dry climates. That is the town of Badami that you see here. And there are these stray boulders which stick up here and there within the settlement itself. And Badami by itself is a very unremarkable town. It's like any of the little dusty towns that Deccan is peppered with. There is a large bus station, very gaudily decorated. That is the biggest thing in the main part of the town. There is one main road, which is the center of most of the activity. There are some side roads in which you find very colorful bazaars, weekly markets and all that. But even when you move through this dusty little town which is not very unprepossessing little town, you have reminder that you are passing through a place which has got layers of history. So you find these fortifications within the town, actually, when you're walking around. Also, in the foreground, where you have the dilapidated buildings here and there in the town, or activities like sheep milling around on the way out to the pasture. As a backdrop, you see some of the buildings that are talked about students of architecture when they talk about beginnings of temple architecture in stone in India. This is the monument known as the Lower Shivalaya. This is the Malagiti Shivalaya. And so you have all these kind of things set in a matrix of very unremarkable everyday scenes. And leaving Badami and looking at the valley in general, the people largely are agro-pastoral. They practice agriculture. They they herd sheep and goat. And they even now, bullock carts are a common sight on the roads between Badami to Pattadakal and beyond to Aihole. But even here, if you keep your eyes peeled, you can see that there are reminders that there are like this Nandi, which is holding this bullock in a place called Banashankari, which is south of Badami. And like I told you, when you see things of everyday activities, like, the plowing of fields, the herding of sheep and goat, And if you walk from Badami to Mahakuta along the sandstone cliffs, you may run into nomadic groups of Lambanis who are moving with all their possessions across the landscape. Or you may encounter people shoeing bullocks and stuff like that. But also you will find some building like this Virupaksha temple at Pattadakal, which is which are things that every student of history of architecture is very familiar with. You find beautiful and very important temples. You find wonderful sculptures like this 18 Nataraja at the cave number 1 in Badami. That's the way it looks like. And Badami, if you go there, it's a very hot place, like I told you. If you go there in the summers, if you wander around too much, you can actually get a heat stroke. So the sensible thing for one to do in the summers is if you find a spot of shade, just lie down and have a snooze, irrespective of whether you're human or whether you're not. Okay. But the same day in late May 2018, I think, when we snapped this picture, in the evening, there was a sudden sharp shower. And while we're sitting in the Bhutnatha temple in the east of the Agastya Tirtha, and that shower just transformed the landscape. Like when you see the Agastya Tirtha soaking up the past earth is really soaking up the rain, and the sandstone takes on a different sheen when it's wet. And the sandstone, which has been baking in the the harsh sun of the Deccan Plateau, assumes a very different sheen when the sheets of water pour down on it. And then, of course, a very mysterious phenomenon, not a mysterious, very beautiful phenomenon, the waterfall that gets activated only by rainfall. So if it's been raining for 15, 20 minutes, raining hard, then east of the Bhutnatha group of temples, this twin waterfalls start coming up, and they form a wonderful dramatic background. Now, recently, I found that this is an artificially created waterfall. I've just published the results of that study. And there's been a small basin which has been cut out at the top of this waterfall here, which is what brings at the lowest point where all the water collects. And then it comes forth, it gushes forth as these twin streams or whatever. So I believe the Chalukyans were trying to give a dramatic backdrop to their creation, the Bhutnatha temple that you see out here, though there have been many more additions in the later Chalukyan period, etc. Not that the landscape was lacking in any kind of drama. As I like to say, the first architects who worked in the landscape were not human. It was actually the wind and the water which sculpted very bizarre and beautiful forms like this finger of rock at a place called Kutukankeri, north of Badami, or this boulder which seems to be defying all laws of gravity by staying perched like this for eons, actually. Or this one near Akkaragal in closer to Aihole, beyond Pattadakal, where you have wonderful formations like this. And these were possibly, inspirations for the artisans who worked in this region. For you find that their response to the landscape has been no less dramatic. But to understand this landscape well, because you have got a lot of cliffs, it would be wonderful if you can climb around in the cliffs around here. So this is recently when I went there, a couple of my interns enjoying the climb around Badami. This is the east of the Bhutnatha cliffs. And the girl on the left here, Kadambari, she is the one who helped me on this work that I will be talking to you about. So once again, whether you're human or not, it's wonderful if you can climb in this region. This is Raja, one of the the dogs who accompanied us during one of our explorations near Akkaragal. He's a wonderful climber, both climbing up and climbing down. But the upshot is that when you climb around in the cliffs near Badami, you get treated to wonderful vistas like these. This is a view from the cliffs to the east of Badami. And what you're seeing here on the left are the cliffs from which you had the cave temples were scooped out of. And on the right, you see the monuments of the North Fort. You can see the Upper Shivalaya, which is the highest monument here. And in the foreground, you can see the Bhutnatha group of temples. Agastya Tirtha, unfortunately, was not full at that time. Now I believe it is full. And, there is a couple of later temples which are again perched on top of a boulder here called Panchalinganapadi. Or if you go to the South Fort, climb on top of the South Fort and look northwards, you see the monuments of the North Fort. So you can see that the architects have actually each of these boulders which have crumbled off from the main body of sandstone in the geological past. There's huge boulders like this, creating deep gorges between them. So you can find that each boulder has got its own monument. whether it's the lower Shivalaya here or the upper Shivalaya beyond, or these rock cut mantapas, which we will talk about in great detail. And you can see a little bit of this monument known as the Malagiti Shivalaya here. Now, I should tell you that though all of these monuments are called Shivalayas, they were not dedicated originally to Shiva. Malagiti Shivalaya was a sun temple dedicated to Surya, and lower Shivalaya was probably dedicated to Ganapati, and the upper Shivalaya was a Vaishnava temple. Yeah, so this one you can see a little bit more of the drama of Malagiti Shivalaya. It's a beautiful little Dravida temple located on in remarkably good preservation, situated on top of a boulder. You can see a little bit of the mud fortifications of the Chalukyas also here in this picture. And this one captures the monument at dawn, the same monument, Malagiti Shivalaya, and the response to the tumbled boulders which lie around it. And it forms a wonderful backdrop to this beautiful little monument built by an artisan. We know the name of the architect because it's been inscribed there, Aryaminchi Upadhyaya. And the one remarkable thing here is that Aryaminchi Upadhyaya could have located it on a lot of flat ground which was nearby, but he chose to locate it dramatically on top of this boulder. I mean, there's plenty of flat ground below the boulder, but he chose this, probably inspired by the surroundings nearby. Similarly, you have to admire the sheer cheek of the architect who sited the upper Shivalaya on the edge of a steep drop. Now, nowadays, I mean, as an architect, if you ask me, I would have very safely, considering the safety of my users, put it somewhere, there's a lot of flat ground to the right of it. But, that's the way they have kept it here. And even the Shikara being a kind of a response to these little protuberance of sandstone and all that. So there's a lot you can admire in the guts of the Chalukyan artisan, early Chalukyan artisan. And so this is your upper Shivalaya. And below that, you can see on this rock, you have the two open mantapas. One is single-storied and one is double-storied. And they are very prominent. You see them from virtually any place in Badami. So I'm showing you different aspects. If you go to the upper Shivalaya and look down, you see them from above. You see them from below. You see them from across the lake. Like I told you, it's basically, this is a view from the South Fort, from the cave temples. You have the single-storied pavilion, which is built on a very high plinth. And then you have the two-storied pavilion. And though they are this prominent, you won't find too many people writing about it. Okay, we have only passing references in a couple of guidebooks, and maybe because they're not very spectacular, maybe because there are so many other temples to write about. You find that George Mitchell has spoken about it, saying that no, they might have been associated with courtly rituals of the early Chalukyas, but he admits that their precise function is unknown. Similarly, in his 2011 guidebook, he speaks a little bit more about it. He talks about, there's a narrow flight of steps leading up from the pathway, and they're built on a rock-cut terrace. And he talks about worn elephant torsos, which I'll show you. And then he also tells here that they don't seem to have been part of any religious monument. And then again, he reiterates that they must be part of a royal ceremonial complex. And another important thing he tells, that a lot of scholars believe that this was a monument which was vandalized by the Pallavas. Now, in this 200-year reign of the Chalukyas, they were constantly trading hostilities with the Pallavas of Kanchi. And, for around 13 years, after the reign of Pulakeshi II, you have the Pallavas invading Badami and occupying it for 13 years. So everyone assumes that these monuments have been partly destroyed by the Pallavas. So Professor Srinivas Padigar also, in his guidebook on Badami, is published by the State Archaeology Department, talks about them as, he talks about the difficulty of reaching the top of the boulder. And there you see the remains of the partly rock-cut mantapa and a double-storied mantapa. And he thinks that that is a place where the kings and ministers held discussions. Now, coming to George Mitchell again in his 2014 book, he again says that they are seemingly unconnected with any temple, and again says that they might have been part of a ceremonial complex. Other than this, it's most writings about this place are silent about this, the purpose of these mantapas. So the locals, though, they call it Gali Mantapa, which translates roughly as the breeze pavilion, and that's what most locals do. You go there, there's usually a stiff breeze, whatever the time of the day, and you can catch a nice, comfortable nap, which is what some of the local residents are doing in this picture. So just to show you how difficult the entry here is, This is Kadambari going up the narrow flight of steps there. You can see that the steps are quite narrow, and there's also the opening is also quite tilted. So in this picture, looking down also, you can see how difficult it is to go up and down this passage. So what I found here is that at the narrowest, this is not more than 40 centimeters wide. And the whole thing is tilted from the horizontal by about 69 to 75 degrees, which means that around 20 degrees off from the vertical. So one has to not only edge sideways at the narrowest portion, one has to also lean backwards or forwards or whatever and creep up the passage, which is something which I felt that maybe Pulakeshi and his courtiers wouldn't have been really keen on doing this, circus-like exercise. Anyway, when you emerge on top of the boulder, this is what you see. This is the single-storied pavilion. You can see that the bottom portion of it is partly rock cut, and the rest of it have been built using sandstone blocks. And here also, the double-storied pavilion also has got a lower plinth, but that is again partly rock cut, and the rest of it have been built by blocks of sandstone. So one thing which struck me when I went up here, when I kept going up here, is that it's very difficult to bring any construction material here. And looking at the amount of rock which had been quarried, I had this pet theory that probably the structure, all the sandstone that goes into fashioning these structural members were all quarried from the top of the rock itself. So you just had the artisans coming up with their tools, and then they quarried the sandstone, shaped them into structural members, and erected these pavilions. Okay, so they are basically standing on the very rock from which the material has been extracted. But of course, it was just lying there as a stray thought. Then when Kadambari came here for an internship to NIAS, I thought that maybe this is something that we could do in the 2 months that she was planning to be here. So we went to Badami and we did some measurements and all that. So yeah, this is how it looks like. You can see the high plinth of the single-storied thing and the low plinth and the double-storied structure of the other pavilion. So you can see here, you can see close-up that you can see even the tooling marks of the artisans who cut away the rock. And you can see the partly rock-cut portion here, the partly rock-cut portion here, and the remainder above has been fashioned from sandstone blocks, dressed blocks of sandstone, dressed and carved blocks of sandstone. Now, one thing you can notice, a lot of people have mentioned is that to the west of the of the pavilion, the double-storied pavilion, there is a step, there's a footprint of a larger structure. Now you can see here that they have leveled the sandstone here like a plinth on which they were planning to put blocks of sandstone and built up the rest of the structure, which many people had thought that it is because they were demolished, but it could also be because they were incomplete. It is an unfinished structure. So now looking at this, these are the worn elephant torsos that George was talking about in his description. So this here you can see very clearly that the tooling marks have not been removed. Once a block of or any part of sandstone is finished, they will be somewhat similar to these, what you can see out here. There would be if not polished, it would be at least with abrasives, it will be a smoothened surface. And this shows that this is actually a part of an unfinished structure. Yeah, you can see here the rock-cut plinth where you can go up a steep kind of flight of 3 steps, and there's a platform here from which they haven't constructed further steps, and it's a stiff climb around 2 meters or whatever. You can see here from this boy trying to clamber up here how high this part of the plinth is. And so there are steps down from the main, the single-storied pavilion with the elephant torsos here, and then there is a Chandrashila or a moonstone which leads up to steps to the double-storied, the lower portion of the double-storied pavilion, quite similar to the moonstone, which is part of the steps that ascend to the sanctum of the cave temple. This is cave number 2 in the Vaishnava cave in the South Fort. Now, once you look at there is a lot of jumble of sandstone blocks lying here, and there's this beams which are projecting. There's one part of the beam which is broken. All this came, and also you can see a part of the column which is broken. All this gave a feeling of willful destruction. Whereas I think that they are unfinished. I'll give you my reasons in a couple of minutes from now on. And then to the behind the double-storied structure, you find these narrow slots that again George is mentioning. These are basically the depressions cut to hold the shallow foundations into which sandstone blocks were supposed to be placed to build up the rest of the portion of the the structural part of the structure. And this sandstone blocks were held together by metal clamps, the remains of which you can see. The clamps, you can't see them, but you can see the slots which are cut so that the clamps could be inserted here to hold them together. So now when you look closely at the upper portion of the double-storied structure, you find that there's some breakage here, and then some breakage, like I told you here. But basically, these are because you can see the quality of the sandstone. It's very poor. It's very textured. It's also very friable, very, very brittle kind of thing. There's a lot of, they haven't been able to remove the top layer of weathered rock, like you can see here, the typical weathering features that the Badami sandstone produces, very snake-like in their remnants or whatever. So it is also probably a question of running out of rock at the top of the structure. But the problem is that this has been giving an impression of willful destruction. But if you compare it with this part, you know, the lower Shivalaya, which has been, we know has been intentionally broken, like this portion, the roofing slabs of the ambulatory, the Pradakshina Patha, you can see it here, that they have been, there the rough edges, you can actually see that they have been broken. In contrast, these beam ends have been left projecting out so that the structure could be continued later. There's even a slot that you see here, kind of a lap joint for the next slab to come and nestle under it, kind of an interlock thing here. You can see it here also. So this structure has been left intentionally, it has been left to be completed, which would, for some reason, it was not completed. And you can see other portions of it. You know, this sandstone is of poor quality at the top. You can see the cracks here and, you know, even the texture, like I was telling you. When you look at the beam ends, they have been properly squared off. They have not been broken or whatever. It's been left intentionally so that you can continue next beam. Probably there would have been another bracket and bracket and a column below it. We'll come to that when we talk about the conjectural restoration. So what we did was we made measure drawings of what is existing, including the structural part which is there, and also the foundations and all the other stuff which are part of the other footprint which has been left behind. And we also made a 3D model of the same, so that we could look, just show you views from different angles of the same thing. So here we thought that we could estimate the amount of rock that has been quarried. So on the left, what you can see here is the upper limit. We've taken this as the upper limit of the rock. And then from here, you can see which part of the rock has been quarried and which has been left, the natural surface has been there. So from this, we can estimate the amount of the cubic meters of rock which has been quarried from here. And then it's very simple to estimate the amount of rock which is there in the building, which is a much more regular structure. So here you can see further proof that the structure is unfinished. On the left, you can see that the moldings are just beginning to emerge out of the basic rock that you can see here. And here the rock has been left. On the right side, you can see that much more work has to be done when the whole project was abandoned. And then you can see at the top, so basically how the structure was built was that they had the columns. On top of it, they had the brackets which had projections in 4 directions or 3 directions in this case. And on top of it, you have a device which is like a beam and an eave combined together. So you have the column, you have the bracket sitting on top of it, which is truncated in the direction where it doesn't have to bear a beam. And on top of it, they place a structure which is a monolithic component built out of. So there's a portion which is a beam, and the same thing projects out and becomes an eave. So you can see the same, and on top of it, they place a stone slab, a series of slabs rather, and on top of which again the next story, the columns are placed. Now, fortunately, we can actually see some of these components lying around. So if you go near the Bhutnath temple, you see these columns lying here. You can see the device. Of course, it's kept upside down right now. So this thing would have been taken. So the columns would have been placed upright. And this portion, the beam portion, would have been placed on top of the bracket which come on the columns. And so you have these components which wrap around the corner, and you also have things which span the distance between the 2 corners. Okay, so you have the whole structure. So when you put it together, you have something like this. You can see here the beam and eave. So you have the column, you have the bracket, you have the beam eave device. I call it that for want of a better name, for better terminology. And then you have the structure kept on top of it, the slabs kept on top of it, a low band of stone which goes around, and then the next story columns happen on top of that. So, when you went to now this structure, most scholars opine, there is the opinion that this is contemporaneous with the lower and upper Shivalaya. Professor Srinivas Padigar, for example, mentioned in his book that these structures could be contemporaneous with which makes it probably 6th century. When it was begun. So this is the upper Shivalaya. And when you look at the entry to the upper Shivalaya, you have the steps coming up here. You have these little elephant torsos here also, similar kind of treatments, also bands of ganas and all that. So when you compare the entry to the the upper Shivalaya and the entry to the single-storied pavilion, they're quite similar in the treatment. Only thing is that the one on the left has not been finished. And there are also other embellishments like this preening hamsa or peacock or whatever avian species you want to attribute it to. That's also quite similar in both the monuments. So there is a case to be made, what the scholars have been telling, that this is probably begun in the 6th century. There are also inscriptions. So in the double-storied pavilion, you have inscriptions on the column. The upper one talks about, gives a name Sri Nalpayan, and below is another architect called Tanuchalvan. So these are the two people who left the names on it. There's also another inscription on 6th or 7th century Kannada, old Kannada characters. It says Sri Govindan Vipra Manoharan. And when we climbed on top of the single-storied pavilion, we found another inscription which had escaped notice earlier. It says, I can't read Halagannada, so Professor Srinivas Padigar translated it very kindly for me. He says it is Sri Kama, written, to be read from right to left. It's written backwards. Sri Kama is probably another artisan who was involved with this structure. So interestingly, Nalpayan, this person whose name is left here, has also been involved with another structure. If you go to Mahakuta near Badami, in Mahakuta, there is a temple known as the Sangameshwara temple. It is a Nagara temple, and depending on which scholar's work you swear by, it could be the middle of say 7th century or the middle of 8th century. So there are various dates assigned to it. The inscription which talks about Tanuchalvan has been paleographically dated to around 7th century AD. So it's quite likely that, so what Professor Srinivas Padigar told me is that even though the early structure was started in 6th century and abandoned for whatever reason, probably during the reign of Vikramaditya II, Nalpayan and Tanuchalvan and Govindan and all that tried to reconstruct, to finish the unfinished structure. So there has been at least 2 episodes of construction at the open mantapas. Now this is very interesting. We are talking about the afterlife of monument. Now there's this monument which was begun in the 6th century AD by some artisans. 100 years later, another set of artisans comes there. Now, could they really understand what was the intention of this? The earlier artisans, we really do not know. And maybe there were some design inconsistencies which could not be solved, and maybe that's why the whole thing wasn't completed. We will wonder about this more in the few slides later. So coming back to proving that conjecture that all the sandstone came from the area which has been quarried here. Now this panoramic view which has been taken from the top of the single-storied structure, you can see that this natural parapet, the quarrying has left a parapet of rock on this side here, and somewhere from here, and you can see here the evidence of quarrying goes somewhat like this. Okay, so from this we estimated the amount of rock which needs to be which was quarried. Another interesting which I should probably mention here is that there is a fortification wall which runs along the other side of the boulder. So this has seen at least 3 phases of reconstruction from what we can figure out from what it looks like. Probably there's a lot of fortifications which were constructed and redone during the Vijayanagara occupation of this place. And you can actually see that some components which probably would have been part of the monument, the open mantapas, like this molding that you can see here, have all been stashed away very unceremoniously into the wall also. Like you can see this other one here, this little molding that you can see here with a bell-shaped capital. So this all become part of the fortification wall. So then looking at the single-storied structure from above near the upper Shivalaya, you can see that they built up the structure here, and there's been earth filling here. The floor has not been finished here. But when you look at the double-storied structure, the ceiling of the upper part of the double-storied structure has a padma, a lotus motif in the middle of the roof slab there, and on the floor, something very interesting. When you look at it with a zoom lens, there is a niche which is usually kept reserved for keeping idols on it. When you install an idol, there is this nested and stepped squares into which you place the idol, which is a tenon which goes into that thing. I can show this to you from another context. A temple which is on the cliffs of the South Fort. There you can see an idol. This temple has collapsed now, but it had an idol niche and the similar kind of nested squares that you can see here. You can see another view of the same thing during the monsoon here. So this tells that this structure probably was meant to hold an idol. So you cannot say it was not a religious structure. It was probably a temple. But what is interesting is that there is an idol niche on the upper floor, whereas below it is a passage. So this is something we'll come back to. It's a little mystifying, and maybe the reason why the whole thing was abandoned. So this gave me an idea that what if the structure, the single-storied structure, was a Nandi Mandapa, like the structure in the Makuteshwara temple at Mahakuta? What if the single-storied structure was a Nandi Mandapa and the double-storied structure was a temple? So here again you can see the squared off ends of the beams and the unfinished portion, the closer view of the unfinished portion of where the moldings have been just being cut out of the living rock, and the much more unfinished portion of the moldings on the other side. You can see another view here. Another thing which tells us about the unfinished nature of these monuments is the steps that you go up through. Now, people have put in some kind of stone blocks there which form a kind of a step pathway, but there are the original rock cut steps of the builders too here, and they look like builder steps which are usually you find in unfinished monuments like this scar. This is far away in Himachal Pradesh, the Masroor rock cut temple. You find these artisan steps which they used to access the upper portions of the rock. They look very similar to what you find here in this area. So further evidence that these are. I'm sure if that place was completed, they would have definitely built a bigger pathway to that region. Okay. Anyway, to see how these structures were carved, once again near the Bhutnath temple, there are partially carved beam eave devices lying around. So now what we can figure out from here is that to carve out a beam eave device to house the structure, to carve this thing out, at least a sandstone block of this size is required. Okay, and similarly, to have a bracket, which is a single piece of rock has been carved into this 3.5 brackets or whatever. So to carve this out, you need to have a sandstone block of at least this size. So keeping this in mind, we started looking at the amount of rock that would have been that was quarried out, that would have been employed, which is locked up inside these monuments. So we came up with these calculations. You can see the volume of the rock cut portion of the single-storied pavilion, 54 cubic meters. The volume of the rock cut part of the double-storied pavilion, which is considerably lower, is 20 cubic meters. Then the empty plinth, which is lying to the west of the double-storied pavilion, this portion, that is around 30 cubic meters. Similarly, you can see here the structural part, 58 cubic meters. So, and the total amount of volume of rock which has been quarried out from the top of the boulder is 203 cubic meters, what we could arrive at. And this is a rough estimate from whatever we could figure out from there. And the volume of rock in the structural parts of the monument, which is much more precise, is about 117 cubic meters. So the difference of these two things, which is about 86 cubic meters, has gone mostly into the fortification wall, to which later smaller elements have been added also. Because today we find 116 cubic meters of sandstone in the fortification wall, but then it has been restored even in very recent times. Now, it is not just important to get this the cubic meters and compare it. The geometry is also important. So what we did was that in the manner I showed you here, each of these blocks which is required to fashion each of the structural members was created and placed in this quarried portion. So you can see that all the components that are required to build whatever we see here could have been very safe. I can very safely say that they have been quarried out from this portion. Okay, so that it's possible to do the thing that I was talking about, that you can quarry out rock from the top and build the structure along with it. So that part, we think we could prove it. So we got a bit more ambitious. So the 2-month period that Kadambari spent here turned into 2 years over, because she went back to her college, and off and on we kept interacting, going back to Badami and trying to figure out. So we thought we will try to figure out what would have happened on the upper stories and all that. Of course, access in those days, many of the temples, this is in Ladakhan, the device that gives access to the upper floors, we can see the hole in the ceiling here, is a ladder of this kind. So with this kind of information in mind, we created whatever the rock cut plinth was to the west of the double-storied mantapa. We just built the whole thing up to 2 floors. And we came up with this kind of a solution, which does not look like a Chalukyan structure at all. In fact, somebody told us that it looks more like a multi-storied car park. So we went about trying to change so these are another view of the same thing. You can see the ladder which we have given here. Okay, so we started looking at something else. On the advice of Professor Padigar, we looked at Ladkan. So this structure that you see here could not have been a Nagara or a Dravida structure. So we thought it must be built in what George Mitchell calls the Malaprabha idiom, which is a very local endemic form of temple, which some people say the Ladkan is not a temple at all. It must have been a community hall because there's an inscription which says that the various ceremonies which happened there, which is like Mundan and naming ceremony and all that. So it's just probably a community hall, but there's also a linga inside it. So this is another view of the mantapa here. You can see the basically the Malaprabha idiom is a reproduction of a timber structure, you could say. It's got the stepped roofs which are slightly sloping, gently sloping views, and a central portion which is flat roofed. So we looked at the drawings that George Mitchell has produced of these things. So you can see here the basically the central bay which is flat roofed, and then the side things which are the sloping roofs which are covered with these log-like structures to cover the joints of the sandstone. And we also looked at another structure which is this is the Durga temple at Aihole, and the entry to it, the Pratoli. So this structure also has a central portion which is raised and flat roofed, and sides which are having sloping roofs or whatever. So we tried this on our structure, and we thought again to keep the entire structure double-storied, but we found that if we slope it away from here, the height of the double-story structure we already know from what is existing, so we can't increase it further. And by giving this, we found that even with the lowest gentle slope that this Chalukyan Malaprabha idiom structures have, you would get this at the sides, you would get a height which is only about half an average human height, so it would not be usable. So we concluded that the entire structure could not have been double-storied. So we came up with this plan. There were two alternatives possible geometrically. One in which this only this much portion is double-storied, and you have a roof at a lower level which wraps around the whole thing. Hipped and alternative, one could think about it. Or so this is how it would look like in 3D. Or you could have the entire bay as a double-storied structure, entire 3 or 4 bays here, and you have lean-to roofs on the two sides at a lower level, and then you would get something like this. And these two alternatives we followed up in great detail. We created the architectural drawings for it. I must apologize for the poor quality, but when I condense these large drawings into a slide, it's not coming out quite well. So we made this drawing. We also made 3Ds, which will give you a better idea from the different angles or whatever. Okay, so yeah, you can see this. This is the lean-to roof alternative. So this is how it would look like. Maybe convincing, maybe not. But then we looked at the other alternative where the roof at a lower level, the hipped end alternative or whatever, which wraps around the whole thing. And there we got a better, I mean, at least it looks like a Chalukyan structure now. You have this place where you have an entry, and then you go into the mantapa. And so this side you have another, I'll show it from another angle. Yeah, this is where you have the single-storied mantapa, which was probably, we assume it as a Nandi mantapa. Then you come down like you have in Virupaksha temple, you go across, get into this. But here we run into trouble. This got steps here, so you are coming into this place here. And there are also steps on the other side. So which is probably for, we could think of it as a courtiers or whatever. And this one is for royalty or priests or whatever, this entry. But then your deity is on the upper floor and you're walking about under it, which is something which we could not, we cannot really explain how that could have happened. And this is another view of it. And this structure, then you can see it. It really looks like the Ladkan or whatever. So this is probably this is probably what the original architects had envisaged it. Now, was this really a temple alone? We cannot really say for sure any more than you can tell about the Ladkan, because the Ladkan temple also, I mean, like I was telling you, it's a community hall or whatever. But there is also a linga installed, people have thought about it that it might have been an afterthought in the, I don't want to go back so many slides, but if you remember the plan of it, you can see here, there's a Garbhagriha at the very end of the structure, and there's Nandi installed in the middle. So maybe they wanted this, the various ceremonies to happen in the presence of God. So maybe similarly here, there must have been some, maybe it's a ceremonial thing, but they wanted it to happen in the presence of God, and which is why you have a linga installed in the upper floor. And you have the Nandi who is actually addressing the deity in the upper floor. You will see that better when I show you a section of it. But here I just wanted to show you, there's a view from the South Fort. When we look at it, you see the blocks of the sandstone which have been arranged to create a fortification wall here. Here you can see much smaller, which must have been a recent refurbishment of a collapsed portion of the wall. And then you see some blocks which are very large, which I thought was very large, even if you take into account that Vijayanagara involvement in this place. So then I went down to the village and tried to take closer views of it. Then you can actually find here that these are actually columns which are supposed to be in the later part of the structure, supporting our hypothesis about columned hall extending there. So I think there's a closer view. You can see this very clearly. This is the column of the upper block, and you can see these little parallel lines which have been scored here. You can see similar things happening here. So we have found at least 4 potential columns of the structure, which have been very, very sadly dumped into the fortification wall, maybe during Vijayanagara periods, maybe later, don't know about it. So just to compare it with an actual Nandi Mantapa of a Shiva temple at Mahakuta, okay, this looks quite similar in construction to the single-story Mantapa, except for the aspect of the high plinth that you can see here, the beam weave device and the thing on top of it. Of course, the Nandi Mantapa becomes a very, very elaborate thing in the Virupaksha temple. But there again, you have the structure outside the temple, and you have the large Nandi inside. There are steps coming down here. You go across, and then there are steps going up into the Mantapa of the Virupaksha temple. So yeah, that's what we essentially thought this might seem like. You have the this, when it was finished, probably they would have even finished this roughly cut portion here, the rock cut portion. It would have all looked like a like a molding or a high plinth of it. And so this is how a section of it would have looked like. They have a very high one because the linga is on the upper floor. So probably we think that maybe the Nandi was addressing that. But this thing about walking below the idol to come up to this station where you can go into the upper floor by the ladder is something that we couldn't resolve. So why did they abandon this structure? So probably one thing I could think of, the Malaprabha Valley has been referred to in literature as the cradle of Indian temple architecture. That's probably a misnomer, because whether it's the Dravida or the Nagara idiom, they seem to be fully formed by the time it appears in the valley. Much of it seems to be fully formed, the basic tenets of it. So it would rather, I think the sobriquet of laboratory of Indian temple architecture is probably more appropriate, because definitely there were a lot of experiments. You see the Papanatha temple in Pattadakal, where the Dravida and Nagara were tried to be combined in the same structure. So maybe this is one experiment that failed. I mean, that's all I could think of, and compounded by the shortage of rock at the top of it. So I'll just leave you with some posters which Kadambari had made, which shows, there's a exploded view of how the structure was put together. This one shows how it would have been extended beyond, the plinth, and how it might have been extended beyond. And this shows all the, false blind alleys that we went through before arriving at what we think is the proper structure here. Yeah, so in the end, I would like to thank Professor Padigar, who has been helping me with every stage of it, from the the blunder of the multi-storied car park to all the rates, including translating the inscription we found. Kadambari and Meghana have been helping out with the measurements there. Kadambari, in fact, is the first author of the joint paper we published on this topic. Adrija was another intern who helped us with some early measurements in this project. And Professor Sudhakara ji of Manipal, who accompanied me in many of the field trips, and who's also my co-supervisor in my PhD. They've all been helpful in this project. And thank you very much for your time. I think I finished on time in 45 minutes, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. It was a brilliant presentation. Thank you for taking us through a very graphic tour, graphic visual tour, and for also bringing together the fragments and this relationship between the part and the whole, also through the graphics, basically how the possible reconstructions of the site as well. So thank you very much, and also for finishing it in time. It's time to go on to the question answer box. I see you have participants from across continents. I can see Arthur Needham, a very famous numismatics expert and also a good friend of mine there. They're all, acknowledging you, acknowledging the lecture. But let's go on to the questions. The first question is by Amita Prashad. She says it's a beautiful presentation. One sec. it says it's a beautiful presentation. It's a beautiful presentation. Want to know as to why heritage study and research is not being done or encouraged by many universities in India. So it's more of a generic question. If you like to take it on.
I have a problem with my. Let me just see. I suddenly seem to have developed a problem with my. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I seem to have. I can't see the screen at all. It is something which is.
Shri,
Yeah,
can
okay,
I read
okay,
this?
okay.
Can I read this out for you?
Yeah, you can read it out to me. Yeah.
See, Amitabh Prasad wants to know as to why heritage study and research is not being done or encouraged by many universities in India.
Okay. I don't know whether that's really true, because I mean, because it's been encouraged in many schools of architecture, many schools of archaeology, so it's kind of spread out among a lot of across a lot of disciplines. But I think, in spite of being an architect, I've come to this in the end, and I mean, I'm sure many of us are from different walks of life who are coming across here. So I don't know whether it's not really being encouraged, but of course, there could be more courses, there could be more encouragement, as you say. But I really don't know whether it's totally not receiving enough encouragement. I don't know if I have answered the question. What are your thoughts on it, Shashank? I mean,
I think the much better person to answer that question is the convener of the series of lectures, Professor Ray. Would you like to just briefly pitch in, Professor Ray?
Yes, partly yes and partly no, because I agree that the schools of architecture encourage a lot of heritage studies, and they do go to heritage sites, but not so much schools of history, which are many more, I would think, or universities, which do historical studies. Delhi University did have a plan to start heritage studies at the undergraduate level. But I'm not sure what happened to it. So certainly, I would say that, yes, partly we need to do much more, given the wealth and richness of our heritage. The heritage studies are just touching the surface, as it were. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
I think I'll just add one layer, more layer to it, because there are different platforms at which it's being studied. There's tourism,
Sure.
hospitality management, where it figures very prominently, architecture, archaeology, heritage management. There's a new discipline coming up. So I think, but there is while there's a lot of different disciplines are negotiating with it. Basically, I think it is not really come in a very big way in a discipline like history. For sure. And also there is a lack of coordination, basically, between the different departments or different streams studying it. So it's very difficult to form a very holistic understanding of things by pooling in expertise from different disciplines and different levels of specialization expertise. Okay, so now we move on to the next question, which is Nageshwar Rao DK. Is red sandstone cliff called, or our red stone, it should be our red sandstone cliff called the Gondwana region? Or basically, I think we want to say that we are a part of that Gondwana region.
I'm not sure. I'm not the right person to answer that. I don't think I have an answer to that. No, I really don't know.
Okay. The next one is from Asha Gopinathan. How do these structures compare with those in Hampi? Visually, there seems to be similarities. Which is older? And then she has a comment as well. The carved steps leading to the temple also resemble.
Belur.
Also resemble those at Belur, basically. So she has a comment which is basically saying that carved steps leading to the temple also resemble those at Belur. And her question is, how do these structures compare with those in Hampi? And visually, there seems to be similarities. Which is older?
Okay, the last part can be very quickly answered. Obviously, Badami is older. So the similarity, I will take that you're talking about the Dravida temples and Nagara temples. So obviously, what you're seeing here, when the Dravida tradition began in the south, it erupted in two nuclei. One is in this Badami Chalukya, this region, and the other nucleus was in the Kanchi region under the Pallavas. Both were Dravida. There were small differences, like, when you have I won't go into the technicality, but there were slight differences between these. And while Tamil Dravida developed in a particular region and culminated with some things like the big temple at Tanjavur, in Karnataka, it undergoes another, there's a transformation. Like, when you look at this Chalukyan building and you look at the buildings of the the later Chalukyas, the Kalyani Chalukyas, you think that they're very different. In fact, people say that they've got elements of the northern element in it, but it's actually a transformation of the Karnataka Dravida, which starts from here. So obviously, but the thing is that around 7 centuries of continuous development and transformation which happened in Karnataka ended with the Hoysalas. The Hoysala architecture, which you see, is the culmination of this evolutionary sequence or whatever. And when temple building commenced again under the Vijayanagara Empire, what you see at Hampi, they adopted the Tamil Dravida. Okay, so you have the inspiration, the immediate precursors of the Hampi temples or the later Chola temples and all that. So superficially, they would seem similar because both are the Dravida tradition, but Hampi would be more of the Tamil Dravida tradition, whereas Badami is the Karnataka Dravida tradition that you've been saying here. I hope I've answered that to your satisfaction.
I'll just take on. I think there's one small generic query by Swati Dasgupta. She just wants to know which of the Michel's book that you have talked about.
Okay, there are several of his books. One I was talking about is Badami Aihole Pattadakal, which is a 2011 guidebook he has published, which is a wonderful. Maybe I have it somewhere around here. I always keep it handy with me. This particular thing. Okay, so other one is his book on it's a much larger book which has got beautiful pictures as well as the architectural drawings of it. I don't know what exactly it is called. But if you Google up my paper, I refer to all these books by, I've given the references in that. My paper on this is available on my academia.edu page. And all Mitchell's books have been given in it. But it's the easiest one you can locate is the guidebook that I showed you just now.
Next are two questions by Samrat Ghosh. And I'll just read them out. Why such an interesting place has not been developed as an important tourist place like Ajanta or Ellora? That's number one. And two, are these temples at Badami architecturally different from temples at Aihole, both under earlier Chalukyas?
Both are very pertinent questions. As for the first question, even it beats me because this is one of the most important sites that we have. And I think it should be developed. And of course, we even have a World Heritage site in Pattadakal. But, the roads have become better lately. But facilities that we were discussing this just before the beginning of the lecture, facilities there can be a lot more provided. Even when you look at Hampi, it's much better provided for than this. And I think there should be some model of tourism development there which involves the locals too, because I know many of them now by going there, and they also do not have a very nice life because they could do with some more improvement in their life, basic facilities there. So I think we should aim for a development of that place which also benefits the locals greatly. And the second question was, are they different from Aihole? No, they were all together, built together. But whereas Aihole, all these regions have, in the title slide, you must have seen the upper Shivalaya on the top of the picture. And there's also the Yellama Gudi, which is a building by the later Chalukyas. So Badami, even after it stopped being a capital of the when the early Chalukyas lost out to the Rashtrakutas, but there was still some temple building activity there till maybe the 13th century or something. In Aihole, you will find much more. You will find that it was also the seat of a guild called the Aihole 500 or whatever. So there was a lot more temple building going on there in the Rashtrakuta period, in the succeeding Kalyani Chalukya period. So you'll be finding temples that look different from these, but they are from later periods. Whereas the early Chalukyan temples are quite similar here and there.
Okay, there's an observation or a small comment there, not a question, by Shivashankar Babu, who is from Tamil Heritage Trust, Chennai. He says a grand revelation done with a logical and logistical analysis. Great work, sir. Looking forward to similar analysis on the lower Shivalaya and its mystery of two stories and the idol. But we move on to the next set of, I think, Jagdish Vekaria, which type stone fitting pillars? I think, he wants to say which type of stones have been used for the pillars.
Everything has been sandstone here. You can see that basically, I mean, though there is granite available in Pattadakal in one of the quarries, but all the stone of preference which has been used throughout is the sandstone. You may find the Nandi in or the Lingas maybe fashioned out of some other stones, maybe schist and all that. But generally the structural, the pillars, all the structural members have been fashioned out of only sandstone.
Shri, this has generated a lot of interest. So we are getting a lot of questions. So I'll keep reading out,
Okay.
and we'll have to answer them perhaps. Quite a few actually. So Jaya Nair, when you hypothesize about monuments where there is no supporting references in literature, how do you deal with the problem of choosing from the many possibilities?
That's a tough question to answer actually. Here what we did was that we have followed mathematically all the possible scenarios, like geometrically I would say, because you have the heights and all that which are already defined by the existing structure. So we took that, and then there's only certain ways in which it can be extended. And now there we had these two alternatives, both of which we followed up. But there is actually one possibility which we haven't looked at, is that what if the single story mantapa is a standalone shrine? Okay, and you could even think of the idol niche at the top of the double-storied mandapa as maybe as a vahana thing, but only thing it wouldn't be higher than the god itself. But there are so what you can do is to exhaust mathematically the kind of combinations and permutations that are possible with the given evidence at hand, and then compare it, like compare it with the existing structures and see how they fare. Do they look similar, or do they look too outlandish to belong to any of these categories? So I think that's the only way one can go ahead with it.
And the next one is from Shubha Khandekar. Thank you. Very informative session. Regarding the hypothetical reconstruction, do you get any clues from literary evidence regarding the function of the structure?
No, unfortunately, no literary evidence has been. Only thing close to that is the inscription, the epigraphical evidence which you could get about Tanuchalvan and Nalpayan and Kama getting involved with the construction. There has been no reference to it in any of the literature, including modern literature, unfortunately.
Kiran Sehgal, she says, pardon my simple questions. What you may choose to answer this, or just or quickly, just what style of architecture is the Konark temple?
Oh, that Konark is what I mean. It's the Odisha region has a distinctly it's endemic style called the Kalinga style of architecture, which is actually a variant of the Nagara. So it's a regional variant of the Nagara, I would say.
The next one is by Mihir Kesari. Do you think that when we talk of Dravida or Nagara form of architecture, we tend to decrease the local peculiarities? And there is a second part to it. Do you think it's important to highlight local particularities in a bid to appreciate fully cultural diversity? Or in terms of saying that, in terms of cultural diversity, is it important to highlight the local particularities?
Absolutely. You touched upon a very important point. Like when you talk about Nagara itself, there are so many different styles that we come across. Nagara, the curvature of if you look at the early temples in Pattadakal, like the Kada Siddheshwara and all that, they've got a very, very squat kind of towers. Whereas when you look at the Galaganatha, which came up later, it has a more slender tapering tower. So there were these things, but they all came in from other places, which I will not go into now for paucity of time. But yes, even when you look at something as simple as Early Chalukya architecture, which is part of northern Karnataka tradition, there are plenty of local peculiarities which add to the richness of their architecture. So you touched upon a very important point. Thank you.
Can I come in on this, Chairperson?
Yes.
Yeah. Can I take you on that, on the this whole division of temples in terms of architecture? That would be, something which Shashank said earlier. That would be one way of looking at temples, sort of discussing them or classifying them architecturally. And I suppose that's where the emphasis and the study has been. So I'm sure there would be other ways of classifying. So do you think that we could move away from the architectural influence and perhaps think of them? I mean, you just highlighted yourself, the importance of Malaprabha and how within a 25 kilometer between Badami and Aihole, there is so much diversity, and perhaps we haven't sort of developed alternative perspectives. I'm not sure how you would respond to that.
I'm not very sure myself, because I've been looking at, see, it's very clear that this Malaprabha Valley has got much more Latina, the simplest Nagara form, the Latina temple, the problem here much more than in northern India maybe. Because they got much more concentration here and in Alampur and all that when you see that. But that also I'm interested in from the point of view of the artisans. I'm sure that there were artisans from Malwa, maybe northern Deccan, Malwa, Gujarat, and all that who came in here. I found some indirect evidence for it in one of the quarries also, because you see in one of the quarries there are plenty of engravings of camels. Now, camels are not there in the Malaprabha Valley. And so I call that little thing dreaming of camel. It's an itinerant artisan who has come down, and when he came down, he's also bringing the style of architecture which is prevalent there. So now I agree that this is not a only way of looking at it, but right now that is one way which we have to get a handle on the whole thing. That's all.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks.
One by Nirdesh Singh. The settlement on the west has become denser, but what is alarming is the settlement mushrooming in the northeast. Dr. Menon, do you think this might soon endanger the Bhutnath temple complex?
I think we can safely say that no, ASI, this is one place the ASI is quite active, so they have their, I'm sure that they will make sure that no, Bhutnath is not, but you are right, that the Thattukote settlement, as it is called, the other side of the Bhutnath settlement, it is increasing at a high pace, but I think they will not be allowed to encroach onto the Bhutnath temple, hopefully. So I have my faith in ASI, and I'm hoping that they will keep it that way.
The next one by Suma Roy Burman is not exactly a question, but it says, thanks, fascinating presentation. The construct is very interesting. Recall an airy Nandi Mandapa in Khajuraho facing the Shiva temple. Separately, can the citation be shared?
Citation of which one?
I think she means, you can just share the article one, basically where you have mentioned about this. Is that?
Okay. Yeah. Maybe if that is the case, then it is fine. I mean, I like I told you, it is there on my, you can email me, or it is there on my academia.edu page. All are available for free download. The full PDF is there. But what you told is quite interesting. Yeah, it is true. The Vishwanath temple in Khajuraho has a separate detached Nandi Mandapa like this. So it looks different maybe.
Okay, another one by Mrudullah Mane. Thank you for such an informative presentation. The volumetric analysis and 3D models were really thought-provoking. Is there any evidence regarding how large stone pieces were carted and erected at their enlarged position? One second. Enlarged positions, and two, what mechanisms or tools were used for that? Mainly, I'm curious about how the lack of space at the top of boulder was negotiated for the construction movements.
That's a very good question, because this is something which I've been thinking about by looking at several monument sites. How did they actually hoist the monument? There was definitely, it is sure that there was some hoisting mechanism involved, which we do not know today. Might be timber and rope and all that. Because if you look at many of these columns, at the bottom of it, you find in the center of each edge of the bottom, you find a little notch. So that would, on all four sides. So that would conform to a sling of ropes being passed from, all sides of it and lifted up. So there must have been some hoisting mechanism involved, which we are not very clear about. This is something which I am working on right now. It's trying to understand how they moved large pieces of stone and how they erected them.
Okay, the next one is by Diksha Bhargava. I think she's from DU, teaches in one of the DU colleges. Besides geographical location, why does the Malaprabha Valley become the lab of Indian temple architecture? Another one where Professor Ray is also, would be good to have her thoughts there. Also, the failed experiment of the structure that you showed and its conjectural redrawing, were there socio-political reasons too?
The first part of the question is because I think it had to do with the rulers being, they had attracted artisans from far away. Even there was a branch of the Gujarat Chalukyas or whatever. So there was a lot of artisans coming in from other locations. We have inscriptional evidence for a priest from northern India coming to the Sangameshwara temple in Pattadakal. So it's quite evident that they were attracting by the kingdom was strong enough to, or rich enough to attract artisans from different places to come and get together for some of these experiments also in those. So it is a location as well as the interest of the rulers to get in this cosmopolitan attitudes towards temple architecture. And the failed experiment, like I told you, I mean, I was looking at architectural reasons, and I'm aware that reasons need not be architectural. There could be something, construed as inauspicious, maybe, which is why the whole thing was scrapped. So I've been trying to look at architectural solutions, but I'm quite aware that the answer might be somewhere else, like you said, maybe in socio-political reasons or in superstition or whatever else. I don't know.
I think the beauty of talks like is this, that you have multiple experts here. So, Professor Reid, would you want to share, your thoughts on the first part of the question, or both?
Yes, yes. No, thank you. Can I disagree with the speaker? I am sorry, but
Please
okay. So if I go back to your earlier work, Dr. Menon, your work on the megaliths. I mean, you yourself have shown how the sanctity of all these sites, whether it's Aihole, whether it's Patadakal, whether it's Badami. I mean, these are all long before the temples come up. These are all, should one use the term sanctified, sacred spaces? Because after all, they're ritual spaces, whatever term you might use, because some ritual is happening there. Now, right. And now clearly there is a lot of movement, and the way the Malaprabha is situated in the early historic period, there's a lot of movement, both inwards from the west coast and from the east coast. And so as I see it, there is a new way of now defining ritual and ritual space, sacred space, and so on. And the diversity, I mean, I do not think there's this kind of diversity anywhere else. You have temples in a lot of places, but the Malaprabha, the diversity that you see out there, and you've written a lot about it. And I go back to your work at Badami, the mortuary spaces that you've written about, the open, the open shrines, not shrines, the open deities carved on the rock. So I would think that, this was already a sacred space. And there are different ways of expressing that sanctity. And now you have a very different idiom with which this is being expressed.
Thank you. Yeah, that aspect is true. I just want to add one more thing to it. What I was interested in is that there have been a lot of places where there are these clusters of temples. Like if you take even Jageshwar in the north, in the Himalaya, you have the Mrityunjaya temple, Dandeshwar, and then they have a smaller temple which I feel are memorials or whatever.
Okay.
So this is a pattern that you see right from the megalithic period, where you have clusters of megaliths. But then only thing which bothers me slightly is that why do some clusters develop into things that become later on, which span centuries like that? And why do some of them stop at the megalithic phase and don't develop further? That's something which I have not been able to answer.
No, that's well taken. And I think, see, the point also is that as of now, sorry, the chair, for continuing this discussion.
Please.
See, as of now, if we, my sense is that if we attribute everything to the royalty, then we don't look for explanations, right?
True.
Your point is very well taken. I mean, there are many megaliths, but they don't develop into temples and many sort of sacred spaces. So then is what you have to then, the socio-political reasons, the roots, the people moving. Why are they moving here? Why didn't they move, say, further down at the other sites in Karnataka, which are also megalithic sites? So I think that's where then you have to look at the larger picture, and then you have to start tracing what was happening on the ground. But if you sort of think or attribute everything to royalty, then we don't move beyond it,
No, that's
so
right.
that would be my. So I mean, I think we need to look and research the other reasons. So that would be my answer. But thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's I say that sometimes you have this advantage of having multiple experts. So a question becomes so well explained. Next one is by Rajesh Shah. Any recommended reading about Chalukyas and Badami to generate interest among the kids, children? Shri,
Sorry about that. Yeah. I don't know about any specific things written for children, but Yeah, this is something which needs to be followed up, I'm sure, because we had I can't remember that author's name. She's been writing a lot of stuff for children, even fiction set in these locales, and also children's view of history from the I can't remember her name. Anyway, so there is no literature aimed specifically at children about Badami and all these places, but I'm sure there's a lot of literature available for older people. But yeah, this is something which we haven't done for aimed specifically at children.
And as I said, when I started taking the question answers, that you have questions from across geocultural locations. So one, somebody from Jammu, Dr. Wasim Rashid wants to, he's appreciating the talk, thanking you for sharing the information about Chalukyas of Badami. But we are having questions from all different parts of the country and also abroad, basically. The next one is Shoma Roy Burman comes back again saying, is there any other example where the space below the icon in the lower level is available for activities, please? Do you plan to follow this mystery?
Not that I know of. That's one thing which has been bothering me throughout when I even wrote this thing up. Is that people have to by the current configuration people have to move under the deity. I've not seen anything. There are many temples in, like for example, Ladakhan itself. There is a upper story where there's a deity installed, but then below it also there is a deity. It's not a passage. So yeah, I've not seen any place where, or I don't know if anybody in the audience knows that. Will be very happy to receive a lead on that.
The next one is sorry, I think whenever a new question comes up, it appears, so it obstructs your reading of the, so it appears on the top. Anyway, I've got back to the question. Sri Samarth Inamdar says, hi Dr. Menon, do you come across early temples in this particular area like the Nashna temple or Tigwa in Madhya Pradesh, or Gop temple or Firangi Dewal in Gujarat? Basically a 4-walled sanctum, usually squarish, possibly a facade made of wood which has perished. He wants to ask that.
Okay. Thank you, Sri Samarth. I hope you're doing fine. Actually, it's a good question. It's a very good question. This is something, when you look around, for example, in Mahakuta, outside the walled enclosure, you have a lot of lingas in the open. Okay, I'm sure that, and Professor Sundara has told me that when he first went there, he found some remnants of brick structures nearby, of which there is no sign present at present. So I'm sure that there must have been some tradition, like Dr. Ray pointed out in the earlier this thing. There has been a tradition of commemorative structures here from very early on, and there must have been practice of putting up lingas and all that, and in some very basic shrines. If you look at again, I'll go back to Mahakuta, and if you look at the little structure called the Bananti Gudi, which is on a little higher ground there, it's a very simple shrine. It's a very simple shrine, a square thing with a small portico. And an early, but I don't know about any timber structure, just the basement whether it has been found. But there is plenty of scope for exploration along these lines because of so many lingas in the open, which must have been within some kind of sanctuary. Thank you.
Jagdish Vikaria asks, is there any water supply tank near the temple area?
The Agastya Tirtha is full of you mean on top of the boulder? No. There has been a little rock cut tank which has been kept there where probably they kept water. But apart from that, there's no source. They must have brought in water and filled up the tank there. The source, that nearby thing, is a huge Agastya Tirtha which is there at the bottom.
And there's one by Kiran Segal. Would you say that Badami architects were the originators of the Nagara style?
That's a very interesting question to which there have been a lot of controversial answers also, which I would not. But much as I would like to believe it, when you work a long time, you start associating with that. I mean, Badami Chalukyas are my favorite, the dynasty and the architecture which I follow. But I would think no. Nagara was already developed by the time it appears in the Latina was a fully developed construct by the time it comes here. And we have evidence for some inscriptions which are there in Badami are written in Siddhamatrika script, which is the early form of Nagari. So some architects have the name written in Siddhamatrika as well as Halagannada. And you have evidence for, like I was telling you in the quarry, you have evidence for architects from other portions. So I would think no is the answer to that.
Okay, we'll have some questions are coming up, and we'll have we'll have to wind up by 6:30. So I think quickly just I'll read out some questions. One is by Richa Chakravarti. She wants to know more about this. Sir, can you please tell me how to progress in this particular field? I am interested since my childhood in art and architecture. It's a more generic question, but if you
do write to me sometime. I think we'll take it up. If you can email me and I can get back to you on that.
okay. Then we have one by Apurva G. Hello, sir. It's interesting talk as always, and Badami remains a fascinating place to visit. I was wondering if there are similar examples of double-story mandapas in general near Meguti Hill or other nearby areas that have slots for idols, as seen in the mandapa of Badami, as a part of experimentation process, or was this one of a kind combination?
Okay, hi Apurva. Apurva, I must mention, was also interned with me sometime, and we did a quite nice work on Jakanachari, the mythical artisan of Karnataka, and whether he was fact or fiction. Anyway, this is a good question. I think you must be aware that Meguti temple has an upper story, and I don't know how the idol is placed in that. I've been there long ago. In 2008, I had climbed to the top. Right now, they don't allow you. I don't know whether it's an idol placed against the back wall or is it installed in the middle of the upper story. I'm not very sure about it. But there are many places where there is an idol in the upper floor. But whether there are slots like this, I'm not aware
of. Quickly, the next question, Geetanjali Mohanty. Fascinating presentation, Dr. Menon. Got me intrigued if this site shows indication of habitation from any pre-Chalukyan period or maybe beyond, that is any fossil findings.
Hi, Geetanjali. This is answer is yes, because in Badami itself, like I was telling you, before this period, you had the megalith building people and maybe even continuing alongside of the temples. So even before that, you have evidence for Paleolithic humans in this region. There's a site called Sidlafadi, which is a short trek away from Badami. And there on the wall, you have Paleolithic rock art. And that it's a beautiful rock shelter, a little distance away from there. So yes, there has been human occupation of this place from very early on, right from the Paleolithic period. And in the southern portion of the sandstone cliffs of Badami, you have this beautiful, huge rock art painted on the top of a tall cliff, which is attributed to the Mesolithic period. So right from the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, there's been continuous human occupation there from the Paleolithic.
The next one is more of an observation, Shiva Shankar Babu. In South, we have many temples in Tamil Nadu of the Ashtanga variety, where 3 sanctums are stacked one on the top of the other, along with the staircase, also within the Vimana. There are around 8-9 such temples, and one by Pallava has 3 tiers, 4 plus 4 plus 1, total 9 tiers. That is Shiva Shankar Babu. The next one is interestingly for Professor Ray. This is Mihir Keshari. Ma'am, can you further elaborate what you meant by alternate conceptualization of the category of temples? Can we categorize temples on socio-cultural lines rather than on architectural lines? Professor Ray, you want to take that?
Yeah. Yes. That's a big question, but since I'm not the one giving the talk, I think I should not take up time. But I think I would argue that certainly there are other ways of classification, and as of now, these only work at a regional or a local level, because the kind of research and the kind of detail you need to come up with another classification has not been done for all the complexes, But if you just look at what Dr. Menon has been talking about, even within these 3 sites, Badami continues. Am I right, Dr. Menon? Till today, it never stopped. Aihole stopped in the 12th century. Pattadakal was only a royal center, and so clearly these sites are not all the same sites. The same kind of Chalukyan sites, even though they have the temple. But their trajectory is different, their chronology is different. So the short answer would be yes, there are other ways of classification, but the kind of research that is required for that needs to be done. And, Dr. Menon has shown that what can be achieved. So I do hope that some of our younger colleagues who are listening in would take this forward. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. I think, since there are 2 minutes left and there are no more questions, so I'll just take the liberty of asking
Yes.
one, basically, since this series and the talks in the series are about afterlife and appropriations and reappropriations, and this site, Badami, continued to be a center of temple building activities for centuries after the
Yes.
Chalukyas.
Yeah.
So, do you see any evidence of these being appropriated by artisans of the subsequent period, or any attempt to work on it or complete it, or even whatever that appropriate it in any sense? Any come across any evidence for that?
Actually, there are some. I can think of one small. There have been modifications by subsequent artisans. For example, one small example I'll tell you is in Aihole. There is this temple called the Huchimalli Gudi, which is a Nagara temple. So it was a proper early Chalukyan temple, but the appearance of this antaral or the vestibule in between the mantapa and the thing came in at a later period during the Kalyani Chalukya period. So you have evidence for lattice screens introduced to create a kind of vestibule where none existed earlier. And that, so to modify the early Chalukyan temple into something that conforms to the plan form of the later Chalukyan temple was done in one of the Huchimalli Gudi temples. Similarly, I can't think of any other examples immediately, but and here itself you've been trying to see 100 years later somebody trying to complete which was started by an earlier artisan or whatever. But yeah, in temples there have been some small modifications like this, but other than that I don't see any appropriations.
But there are also additions. I mean, Patadakal has a Rashtrakuta edition just across the road.
Yes.
So, and Bhutnath, you mentioned, is a later edition. So even, so clearly that space, it's not as if the Chalukyas built it and it was abandoned, but that space continued to be used, and new temples, came up in the interstices. And again, you talked about the mortuary practices on top of that, that big rock, that boulder.
The boulder.
We don't know, it's hard to date it. So there are all kinds of practices which continued even at Badami right through.
Yeah, they did not appropriate any existing, but yeah, there were many additions. And in fact, now that you tell me about the Rashtrakuta presence, if you look at the early cave temple at Aihole, the Rawalfadi, the Rawalfadi, one side of it has been extended, an extension was started, but then abandoned again. Yeah. So it was clearly it was completed during the time of the early Chalukyas, but when you enter to the right side, that has been extended during the Rashtrakuta period, and they've also added temples in front also.
And Siddhanakolla, for example, it was a rock shelter, and then you have it was a rock shelter with Lajjagori. Then you have a Chalukyan temple built in front.
Yes.
So at some point, I mean, the rock shelter is already there, the Lajjagori is already there. So why on earth are you now, there's a new Chalukyan temple? So appropriation maybe not the right
word,
not the right word, but certainly spaces continue to be used.
Great. I think this is turning out to be one of those talks where, we can go on the fascinating discussions, but like all good things come to an end. We will need to, I think, we are just, the time, we've just reached the time where we need to conclude the session. So thank you very much, Dr. Menon, for a very brilliant presentation. You can see from the question answers that the interest that generated and from across different geocultural locations. So thank you very much, Professor Ray, for your additional thoughts. Normally this was one of the talks that we could bring in your expertise to a very good purpose. And thank you all for your very good questions and very interesting questions, and all those who could attend the session today. With that, we come to the end of this talk today, and and on that note, we'll sign off. So thank you, and take care, all of you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.